Hey again, everyone. Hope you're all having a great week and looking forward to the sort of final countdown to Election Day. I know that this is a time of great anticipation and also of great consternation. So I hope that you're all taking care of yourselves and trying to log off of your various social media devices every once in a while and take a deep breath, right? But of course, today I want to talk about a topic that I think is actually quite related to this broader remark about the fact that our elections are so contentious right now and our elections are so worrisome in a variety of different ways. And that is of course, the topic of political polarization. And when we think about polarization, we can ask, I think, a foundational question, which is how would we describe it? How would we define it? I think a lot of us have very clear assumptions about what polarization is in our heads without really delving into the subject and asking ourselves the tough questions about what do we really mean by this. I think a lot of Americans tend to think of polarization as essentially meaning that Americans are extreme, essentially, in their political positions. And I know that many of you are thinking about either going home for Thanksgiving in the next little while. Maybe you already are home and you're going to have Thanksgiving at the same table where you eat all your meals, or maybe you're going to travel, or maybe pending the recommendations of the CDC and other agencies at the state level, you're maybe going to be having a Zoom Thanksgiving, like some of us who live far away from their families. If that's the case, regardless, you could think about the fact that in an extended family, you might always have some crank, some uncle, some aunt, some cousin, nephew, whoever, who's going to come to the Thanksgiving table with a bunch of extreme political positions. They're going to say stuff about, how, I'm not even going to give you any examples, right? So, hugely non-median, let's say, political opinions about this, that, or the other thing, both on the right or the left or the up or the down or the upside down, whatever it is. We know that we occasionally encounter people with these really extreme positions. I think a lot of people think about polarization and describe it that way. There's a lot of people out there maybe who have very extreme political positions. However, I think when we back up and think about the scholarship of polarization, there's actually a whole variety of different forms of polarization that we could think about. And the first one that is perhaps the most well studied in the literature and political science is ideological polarization. By that, I'm talking specifically about the idea that legislators especially are more extreme on a one or maybe a two-dimensional, but generally a one-dimensional ideological scale. We generally know about this at the elite level through the voting behavior of Congress. So essentially, do legislators vote together on bills, or do they disagree with each other on bills? And what maybe is the content of those bills, that legislation? Essentially, when we have two clusters of individuals who are always voting for either extremely sort of left legislation or extremely right legislation, we can say that we have a highly polarized Congress. And so there's a lot of different sort of measures of that. Several political scientists have gone to extraordinarily painstaking lengths using a lot of advanced statistics to try to calculate essentially the ideological sort of roll call voting scores for legislators across the board. We could also apply this idea of ideological polarization perhaps to individuals as well, right? So this, maybe we could also place just rank and file citizens on this scale as well. So we could think about people who hold, again, these very extreme political positions, saying, you think about, for example, the abortion issue, right? An extreme abortion position would be to say something like, under no circumstances of any kind, right? Not, like literally no circumstances, right, is any kind of abortion legal, even if there's extreme danger, for example, to the mother of the child. An extreme position on the other side would be to say, like, like abortions are, can be legal up to the, the entire pregnancy or something. That also, I think, is a position that would place you pretty far away from most people in terms of their positions on the issue, regardless of whether they're pro-life or pro-choice. Those are kind of at the polar ends of the scale of sort of what's possible in the policy space. And so if we think about that as being an example issue across all kinds of different issues, we could array people on this unidimensional, sort of single sort of smushed together dimension of conservative and liberal policy positions, and then place people at the extreme ends of those scales. So maybe there's a lot of people like that nephew or cousin or aunt or uncle who's going to come to Thanksgiving and talk about these really, really extreme ideas for which way to take the country in terms of its direction. Maybe that's one way to think about polarization. Another way is actually something that we might think about as agenda polarization, which is to say the issue priorities of the two parties start to differ. So it's a little different than saying we have extreme positions. This is saying that sort of the basket of issues that we want to address in the first place start to get very different. So one example that's very topical that we could certainly think about is the question of like police reform and accountability, right? One party might say this is like one of the top priorities in American politics today. We need to sort of get to the bottom of these kinds of instances, and we need to do something to try to provide more monitoring, oversight, training of police officers. Another party might say that's not on our basket of relevant issues. Police departments are fine the way that they are. We're going to give them autonomy. And so, again, the question of what goes on the agenda can also be a form of polarization. When the two parties always want to take up the same issues and debate them and move them in either a conservative or a liberal direction, that means that the agenda is generally concurrent or agreed upon. But when we have very divergent agendas across the two parties, that could also be a kind of polarization. Even more potentially disturbing, perhaps from a normative perspective, is this question of factual polarization. And this is something that I have studied to some extent in my own research, which is essentially the degree to which Americans simply cannot agree on the facts. When they interpret real current conditions and developments through these different lenses. And certainly we can go back to, I think the sort of emblematic example of the literature on motivated reasoning that we've read this semester is the Biscard piece that's looking at economic perceptions. I mean, a lot of my research has examined the gap, essentially, between Republicans and Democrats and thinking about whether the economy has been good or bad in recent time. And so when, there's an 80% gap where, say 90% of Republicans say the economy is fantastic and only 10% of Democrats say the economy is good, that's a really worrisome sort of sign of polarization as well. Where again, we've got these intractable, simply different opinions and attitudes towards just reality, the reality of the situation. So ideology, agenda, and factual polarization are all actually different kinds of polarization. And depending on what's going on in a society at a given time, those polarizational dimensions can be differently. You could have a country where there's very rarely ideological polarization, but there's a lot of agenda polarization. Or a country where nobody can agree on the facts, but people generally tend to agree on ideology. There's not actually a tremendous amount of extremism in terms of the ideology that people want. So these are all different ways that we could characterize and conceptualize polarization. But there's more. But wait, there's more. It's the Billy Mays theory of polarization. We can go beyond that and think about also another form of polarization called affective polarization, which is essentially to say this is the emotional dimension of polarization. And certainly we're going to be reading about that this week, and I hope that you pay close attention to this idea. The idea that we might develop increasingly strong feelings. We might attach feelings towards actors who belong to the political parties and the idea of the political parties themselves. And you start to see statements in a society where it's like, "Ugh, those people make me sick," right? This party is so great and is doing so much and are so justified in their actions, and we feel so good about a party, we feel so bad about a party. Closely related is this theory of negative partisanship, which essentially says negative partisanship starts to become the name of the game when people start to see the other guys as being really bad. And specifically, the most intense kind of example of this is when people start to see the other guys as being morally unjustifiable. So to say, like, the other party is not just wrong, but they're disgusting, right? The other party is not just wrong, but they're essentially immoral. They're evil, right? Calling the other party evil is an example of negative partisanship. And so it's not just about policy anymore. It's not about ideological positioning. It's about thinking that the other people are wrong to their core and wrong in their character and not just in their issue positions. So this actually, as we'll read, is something that's been increasing dramatically over the last decade or so in American politics. It's one of the big things that differentiates this current era of politics, say from, election 2000, for example. If we look at the Bush versus Gore kind of election, you didn't have a lot of people saying X party is evil in that election. It was much more about disagreements. And now we have this next layer. And so that, I think, is something we want to talk about, certainly in our discussion for this week. There's one other form of polarization that we should discuss, of course, which is also this question of sorting. which is to say that we're picking up cues from one preferred party from the preferred party that we attach ourselves to, that we identify with, and that essentially, as we've talked about, increases the degree to which our issue positions are correlated, not extreme, but correlated. And so I think we've already talked about this. I've shown you sort of an example in our class discussion of like sort of two individuals, one whose issue positions are all sort of lining up on the conservative direction or the liberal direction, and another person whose issue positions are all sort of zigzagged all over the map, where they've got liberal and conservative issue positions. This sorting is to say that people are getting cues from the preferred party, and they're changing their issue positions so that they start to become all in one column. And that's not to say that they start to become really, really extreme on one side or the other. It's simply to say that they're consistent in their positions. They're consistently center right, or they're consistently center left on a lot of different ideas. And so again, that's very different than ideological extremism or polarization. Extremeness is not the same as consistency. And so again, going back to these competing definitions, we've got ideological, agenda, factual, affective/negative partisanship, and then this consistency-based definition of polarization. All of these definitions have very different implications for the way that politics is practiced and the way that candidates compete for voters. So the question that we want to really think about here is, of these kinds of polarization, of all these kinds, which seem to be occurring the most, the least, and why in our current politics. And also, and I encourage you to think about this, we'll talk about this a lot more in our class discussion this week, what about the idea that some people are also sort of tapping out of this paradigm of partisanship and becoming independent? Maybe this could counteract some of the polarization kind of story that we might be experiencing otherwise. And so again, I do want to focus on, we can certainly debate, and we'll talk a little bit more about this discussion of which kinds of polarization are most and least visible in today's society. This idea that negative partisanship has become perhaps the most important story of all in this paradigm. And so Liliana Mason has this really famous kind of statement here. This is this idea that partisans today say, "I disrespectfully agree." So even though there's a lot of partisans in the electorate who generally see eye to eye, surprisingly, on a lot of different issues, Republicans and Democrats tend to see some of these issues with the same mentality, they nevertheless say that the other party's evil and bad. And so this disrespect to the other party, despite like large quantities of policy agreement, maybe is characteristic of today's polarized, seemingly, political situation. And so, we can also think about why negative polarization might be occurring, right? Going back to, for example, Hilly, Guss, and Shields. Right? We just read Hilly, Guss, and Shields, and we probably want to think also about Zoller as well, this idea of queuing responses and filtering information, and thinking about persuasive messages versus queuing messages, the kind of metadata that messages contain. And also this idea of these persuadable partisans that are being persuaded on the basis of specific issues. It could be that there are cues here, party cues. Essentially, this is a top-down story. There's party cues that are signaling more and more to people that the other guys are evil. And if that's true, then how do we combat it? How do we deal with it? Is it a problem, right? And also, I think a corollary question that I don't really have a good answer for is, why might elites find it in their best interest to exacerbate this kind of disagreement, even though from a purely kind of academic perspective, it seems a little bit like playing with fire? Why would elites seek to poke this bear so much? And if they did, if they are responsible for poking the bear and increasing this degree of affective negative partisanship, can we get the bear to go back to sleep? Because, I care a lot about democracy. I hope you care a lot about democracy too. I think it goes without saying that this stuff is probably not super great for democracy today. So the last thing that I'll ask you to think about before we get together in our group discussion this week is to, again, really think about how this, regardless of how you want to characterize or describe polarization in the electorate today, how this might revise a lot of the stuff we've been talking about so far, right? How does polarization inform our theory of cross pressures and the idea that some voters are persuadable? How might it inform theories of issue ownership and the most important problems facing Americans today? How might it inform, the median voter theorem, for example, and this idea that parties are supposed to be competing for this person who's in the true middle of the distribution? How about partisan motivated reasoning, right? Do we think that polarization is cause of this, an effect of this? How is it related? And then also this question of these issue voters, maybe the elusive single issue voter, and particularly these more sophisticated voters who are really going to the polls on the basis of their pet issues. Does polarization have something to say to them, or maybe do they have something to say to the pattern of polarization that's happening today? So I leave you with some of these questions. I hope that this new layer, kind of added layer of theory about polarization is as useful to you as you continue to think about our broader concepts, and especially as, of course, we ramp up to determining who will be the winner of the 2020 presidential election, hopefully on November 3rd, but presumably in the days following. So have a great week, and I very much look forward to talking to you about polarization in our Wednesday class discussion. See you next time.